Okay, so I want to welcome everyone, and especially our guest tonight, Emily Schaeffer Omer-Man. We're very lucky to have her. She's a international star who normally talks to the United Nations and along with Diana Butu to Peter Beinhardt. But she's going to be with us today, and in a moment, Tony is going to introduce her. In the meantime, I want to spend a second just reminding people of what's coming up. And in a month, we're having Joseph Avasar, who has done a series of statements on why a Jewish state cannot be a democracy, and he will expand on that. The month after, we're going to have Gideon Yefet, who is right now in Israel because his son is in the army on the northern front, and he's going to come back and report what it's like being there during war. There are two things I want to do before I turn it over to Tony, and the first is that let me go back here just a second. The first is that a Global Echo, who we're going to hear about today from Emily, is a volunteer, an organization that can really use donations. So I've got the donation down under Emily's picture here, and it was on the announcement, and it will be on the email with the recordings that will come out in about 2 hours after this ends. The other thing is that we are joined today by David Mandel, who is an old friend of LA Jews for Peace, and it turns out a longtime friend of Emily Schaeffer Omer-Man. And he is running for Congress, and he's an anti-corporate Democrat. And so it fits in with Emily's going to talk about. And we're going to give David the floor for a few minutes to mention his campaign and I guess ask for donations. David?
No, you have to download the app. Jeff, you need to ask everybody to mute out. There's a background music.
Which, doesn't.
Thank you, Ori.
I don't hear the background music. Hello, Jeff and everybody. Thanks. Can you maybe not share the screen so I can be on the screen?
Yeah, just a second.
Nice.
I will do that. It'll take me a second.
Okay. Well, I'll start talking then, since you want this to be quick. I really appreciate you letting me talk to you all for a minute. I know a lot of you. Several of you have already made donations. I don't know if I would count myself as a good friend of Emily's. We've met a few times, and I admire her work. And hello, Emily. And I made a donation to Global Echo.
Okay, David, you're a co-host and should be able to share.
Oh. Okay, I'm not asking to share. I'm asking you to stop sharing so that I could be on the screen and people could see me. Is that okay? Can you do that? Well, I'll keep going meanwhile. Sorry. Jeff, did you hear what I said? I hope so.
No, what did you say?
I said I'm not asking to share. I was asking you to stop sharing so that people could see me. That's all.
Oh, okay. Okay, just a second. How's that?
There we go. Okay, so now if you go on speaker view, you can see me. And hello, everybody. Hello, Emily. I think I'll just repeat quickly what I said before. Longtime friends with a couple of you. A couple of you already donated. I know Emily. I wouldn't say we're longtime friends, but we've met a few times, and I admire her work and made a donation to the Global Echo among my end of the year donations last month. As Jeff said, I am running for Congress. I've long been active in the Progressive Caucus of the Democratic Party, getting a lot of support from people there. But the impetus that drove me and a lot of other folks here in Sacramento to file at the very last minute, it was just over a month ago, was Gaza. Even longer than I've been involved in the Progressive Caucus of the Democratic Party, I've been involved in a number of different movements and organizations fighting for Palestinian human rights, both in Israel when I lived there in the 70s and 80s, and here in Sacramento ever since. I've been a longtime member of Jewish Voice for Peace, though I'm not representing them. JVP can't be involved in politics because it's a 501c3. Anyway, our member of Congress, whose name is Doris Matsui, has been in office for 18 years. Before she succeeded when her husband died suddenly 18 years ago, and he was in office for 27 years. So we've had a 45-year dynasty of Matsuis. She hardly comes to the district. She hardly has any presence, most of her donations are corporate, particularly the healthcare industry. So she's not the so-called healthcare industry, so she's not supporting, for instance, single-payer healthcare. There are lots of other things, and they're all part of our platform and our website, which I will put in the chat. But like I said, what drove people over the edge to decide to have me run, and I was available. This wasn't something I was planning on doing, but I'm in a position to do it. Was Gaza. She refused to even meet with us to talk about it back in October, November, let alone support the ceasefire resolution or anything close to it. A number of us sat in all afternoon in her office and refused to leave, and even sort of got arrested. I won't explain what that means, but back in the very early November. So we're running, we're very serious about it. We've been collecting a lot of donations. We're collecting volunteers. We're canvassing targeted districts of former Bernie supporters and the people who meet that demographic, a lot of young people, the folks who don't often vote, on the assumption that if we can reach them and get them interested. That was Beryl's phone. You need to mute Beryl. If we can reach them, we think we have a chance of winning. There's only one other candidate in the race, a Republican who is unknown. He was a failed city council candidate from Galt, which is a tiny city at the very southern end of Sacramento County. And we only have to come ahead of one or the other of them to make it through the primary and get to November. You all know how California's system works. It's the top two regardless of party. So that's the background. As I said, I will put the website in the chat, and you go there, take a look, see what you think. And we really need some donations, particularly if you can dig deep and afford it for somebody who's a longtime comrade in this area. And if you know anybody in Sacramento in particular, we need volunteers to go out and do this canvassing. And there's some work that can be done by volunteers remotely as well. So feel free to sign up on the volunteer page. But that's the quick version. Lots more I could say. Jeff said that if there's extra time at the end and some people want to hang out, I could answer questions, but I'm not going to take time from Emily to do that now. So thanks very much for listening. And I look forward to hearing what Emily has to say.
Thank you, David. And I will put the link to your website and the donations in the email that will have the links to the recordings. So now I turn the floor over to Tony, who will introduce Emily.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to LA Jews for Peace and a presentation that we've been looking forward to for a couple of months now since Emily agreed to do it. But if I remember correctly, it was before October the 7th that you agreed. So, Jeff, I think maybe you got that extra thing on and it's echoing.
No.
Okay.
Just fixed it.
Okay. I've known Emily for well over 10 years. She, full disclosure here, is my daughter-in-law. And I am extremely proud of the work that she's been doing with Global Echo. First of all, in founding it and in working hard with it, and in all of her human rights work that she's done in Israel and here in the United States since they moved here about 1.5 years, going on 2 years now. Emily has done wonderful human rights work. I didn't even know that she had represented the village of Bilin. I knew about Bilin long before I knew that Emily was the one who would represent her. She worked for Michael Svard's law office for many years before going out on her own with Global Echo. And she has just done remarkable work helping Palestinian groups like Al-Haq and Breaking the Silence, Who Profits, all of whom have become targets by the standard Israeli political establishment. And most of all, I remember sitting about 5 rows back from her in the Israeli Supreme Court when she represented Omar Shakir from Human Rights Watch in a trial in which the court decided to kick Omar out of Israel because of some prior association that he had. And you could see how the cards were stacked against human rights work. Currently, Emily has got a position as the adjunct professor of law in the School of Public Affairs at American University. And we're looking forward to hearing about the work that Global Echo Litigation is doing. And if she has time, I would certainly hope that she would begin to comment on certainly the human rights filing that has been done with the International Court of Justice this past week. Emily, take it away.
Thank you so much, Tony. Yeah, that was an incredible introduction, and it's true. I agreed to do this briefing, and I'm honored to do this for the second time before October 7th. I will say that I had tickets to go to Israel on October 9th, which I did not use, and I am waiting for the right time to use those tickets. But I understand that right now, I'm sure a lot of you want to hear the perspective of a lawyer who's been active on the ground on the current crisis and the various legal actions that have been taken. So I am definitely going to cover those, and I am absolutely a resource for asking your questions about that. So I want to start by giving you a little bit of background for those of you who weren't part of the last briefing that I gave or haven't otherwise encountered me. I'll give a brief background about myself and my expertise. I'll tell you about Global Echo and our current cases and the work that we have on deck. And then I will also give you sort of a preview of my take, a quick take on, or hot take on what is happening right now in the International Court of Justice, as well as the International Criminal Court. And then I will open it up for as many questions as you want to ask me. And I'll try to leave a lot of time for that in order to make sure that we cover what you're most interested in. So just to give, again, a little bit of background, as Tony said, I have worked in the Israeli courts for about 12 years. I am an American Israeli dual citizen. I grew up in Boston, and I moved to Israel because of a deep passion for Palestinian human rights, and because I was without a better term for it, outraged at what was happening in my name. And I went through a long sort of transition process, had a lot of different experiences, but ultimately seeing what Palestinians were going through with my own eyes already, even before the Second Intifada, made me become dedicated to changing the reality, or at least trying to do so. And law is the tool that I chose in many respects because it is universal. And despite all the ways that we know that it is political and it is influenced by geoeconomic and political power, it is also incontrovertible. There are tools and rules that we can use. And I think that right now, what we're seeing is in many ways kind of a new wave of the law being used as a tool to call Israel out for what it is doing. I think that South Africa and Turkey, we're going to start seeing a lot of the global South saying to the global North, you created these international legal norms, but you are not upholding them. And we can talk more about what that means. But that is what I see on the horizon right now. I spent those 12 years, so to give you again some of the legal background, I spent 12 years litigating in the Israeli Supreme Court on behalf of Palestinian individuals and communities and NGOs. As Tony mentioned, Al-Haq is one of them, Human Rights Watch, and many others. I represented the village of Bil'in. I also, after the caste-led operation in 2008 to 9, I represented various Palestinian organizations in challenging the IDF's use of white phosphorus in Gaza. And I also was part of a long-term project to try and analyze Israel's ability to investigate its own soldiers and commanders when they are in battle in Gaza, but also when they are simply carrying out daily occupation activities in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. And I think that is relevant, and we'll come back to it when we talk about international law and international tribunals. And the reason I say that is because Israel will try to claim that it can investigate its own soldiers and commanders for their activities. And I'll tell you later what my expertise shows about that particular issue. After about 12 years of litigating these kinds of cases in the Israeli legal system, I decided for a number of reasons that was no longer the strategy that I wanted to pursue. And one of those reasons was because I understood that the Israeli legal system was not set up to change policy, to change law, and ultimately to provide Palestinians with not only human rights in a general sense, but also a path towards a future. And it was no longer a place where I felt that I was able to put my time and effort. And at the same time, I started to understand that not only are there geopolitical forces at play, but there are geoeconomic forces at play. And the Israeli occupation has become profitable, and not only profitable, but part of what Israel counts on in order to sustain its daily reality. The Israeli economy and the settlement economy are indistinguishable. And Israel relies on the resources that it can take from the occupied territory particularly the West Bank, be they water, natural resources like aggregates, stone, for concrete, for construction, and even down to the minerals from the Dead Sea that can be marketed for, now our beauty products. But on a wide scale, Israel is not only relying on the settlement industry in order to, as it at least perceives, maintain security, but also for its own economy, for its own economic interests. Under international law, an occupying power is not permitted to use any of the natural resources, and natural resources can also include land, right? Not allowed to use the land or what's underneath the land, including its water, for any purpose other than for the bare minimum needs of the occupying forces to maintain that occupation. And that maintenance has a whole set of rules and restrictions, or to benefit the occupied population, in international law known as the protected persons. So anything that Israel does in the occupied territory that is not for either of those two purposes has no legitimacy. And yet we see Israel extracting natural resources to create the concrete that then builds homes inside Israel, and also settlement homes. We see Israel creating industrial zones, putting factories in the West Bank because it's cheap real estate, in order to produce a variety of products that are then sold either on the Israeli market or exported abroad, that bring profit back to the Israeli economy. None of those activities are permitted under international law. And Israel is, again, relying on those. The fact that it's relying on the income and the resources from those activities is why Israel will never give up the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. Now we have a whole other question about Gaza, but the industry, the main industrial and resource heavy area is the West Bank and East Jerusalem and the Golan Heights. And Israel will not give them up unless it has a reason to do so. So far, the international community has not put pressure on Israel to do so from a legal or political standpoint. The economic angle is one that has been successful in other conflicts around the world, in other contexts around the world. When I was in law school 20 years ago, the United States was leading the frontier, the next frontier for human rights accountability, by utilizing the United States legislation, the Alien Tort Claims Act or the Alien Tort Statute, to bring claims against companies that were either based in the United States or had some other connection to the United States, and that were violating international human rights abroad. And that statute, that mechanism has been whittled away to the point that it's basically on life support right now. I won't go into all the details, but if anyone's interested, I can lay out the, kind of evolution of how in the United States, corporate accountability has been reduced over the years. Meanwhile, in Europe, over the past decade, there's been kind of a revolution. And in 2011, the United Nations published the UN guidelines, the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. Often you might hear the UNGP, the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. In 2011, the United Nations published this broad document that said corporations can no longer think of themselves as immune from international law. They are actors, they are players in the international legal space. It's not just about governments and government actors. It's also about corporations. Corporations can either be complicit, they can be accessory, essentially, to actions that governments take. And in some cases, they can commit human rights abuses directly by themselves. So there are some things that they can do that assist governments and militaries, and other things that they can do directly that violate international law. And that is because, I don't think I have to tell all of you, the world, and not just the United States, is increasingly moving towards privatization. So what were traditionally state and military functions have been outsourced to corporations. And Israel is no exception to that. And not only is Israel no exception to that, but because it's a very small country, it also is lacking a lot of the equipment and expertise that it might need for various functions. So for instance, Israel has no companies that manufacture bulldozers, heavy machinery, big tractors, big excavators, big diggers, and bulldozers. Israel also has no expertise locally in tunneling. There's a lot of tunneling that's been done through the West Bank in order to allow Israelis to access different parts of the country, whether it be in the West Bank or just even from Jerusalem to Tel Aviv. The Jerusalem to Tel Aviv fast train that has completely revolutionized the transportation, the public transportation in Israel, goes for about 20 kilometers under the West Bank. So Israel has relied on foreign companies to provide equipment and expertise for a long time. The reason that I decided then to pursue this particular strategy is because I see how deeply the Israeli economy and the Israeli occupation depend on foreign corporations, and also because, as I think I mentioned before, I got to the point where I was bringing cases in the Israeli legal system, be it the Israeli Supreme Court, the military courts, lower courts, and I realized that Palestinians were not going to realize they were not going to find justice. We were not going to end the occupation in these systems. I could provide a particular individual Palestinian with individual remedy. I could maybe get one Palestinian the right to have a permit to access medical school or do their medical training in East Jerusalem if they were from the West Bank. Or I could provide an individual family with the right to access their plot of land. But I was not going to change the policy about allowing medical students to access East Jerusalem for their medical training. I was not going to change the policy for Palestinians to access their privately owned land. The Israeli legal system will allow for individual victories, and it will do so. We can think of a range of reasons, and in best case, because that's the right thing to do, and in a worst case, because allowing those individual victories allows the Israeli legal system, the Israeli judges to sleep at night, and the Israeli legal system and Israel in general to tell the world that it has a fully functioning legal system. And it's very important to Israeli justices, especially in the Israeli Supreme Court, to feel that they are among the elite judges of the world. And this is very important for where we are right now. It looks like there's a question. I don't know if we want to stop and take the question. No, Beryl. Okay. Beryl, you're muted, so I don't know if you're trying to ask a question or make a statement. No. Okay. One of the highlights of this particular year. So I will tell you about Global Echo and our work. 6 years ago, I founded Global Echo Litigation Center, which is the first organization dedicated to representing Palestinian litigants in foreign courts to hold corporations accountable for systematic Palestinian human rights violations. And the reason, again, that we decided on this strategy is, as I said before, the Israeli courts were not going to bring justice, and the economic actors, such a huge part of what is perpetuating the occupation, that it was no longer feasible, in my eyes, to ignore that. There had been several cases brought in the past, including by myself and other legal teams, that had not succeeded. So the first step in forming this organization was to take a back step, take stock of what had been done before, and start to analyze what are the right legal strategies to bring, what had worked, what hadn't worked in the past. And after doing that, we brought our first case against a European company that was both pillaging natural resources from the West Bank and using them to create the concrete that was laid onto the foundations of settlement residential homes. That case is still pending. The second case, and the reason that we wanted to come together today, was filed in September of this year. And that is a case against a Dutch company that is involved in designing, planning, supervising the infrastructure for settlements to have water and waste management systems. These are essential services that settlements cannot exist without. This is also a company that was part of creating the water pipeline that connected the Israeli national water system to the settlement water system for the first time. And several governments, even before this very right-wing government, have been talking about a massive expansion of the settlements and the settlement population. And that can only be possible with the provision of basic services, whether it's electricity or roads, or in this case, water and waste management systems. You can think of the circle of tents that starts some of these settlements, but eventually they are going to have water being pumped in and waste management. There is no way to get around that. So this is of the most essential kinds of services before you even think about schools or even transportation, right? And we made the claim before the Dutch public prosecutor that these essential services constitute aiding and abetting the war crime of transfer. Now, what is the war crime of transfer? And this is important as we think about the ICC and the ICJ, all of the different international tribunals that may be looking at Israel right now. The war crime of transfer comes from the Fourth Geneva Convention. It's based on Article 49, paragraph 6 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, which in the first additional protocol in 1977 of the Geneva Convention, so 1949, there were 4 Geneva Conventions created in the wake of the Second World War. And then again in 1977, the countries that were party to those Geneva Conventions came back together, and they wrote 2 additional protocols that were like amendments or addendums to the initial Geneva Conventions. And the first dealt with international armed conflicts, and the second dealt with essentially civil wars, internal conflicts, what they're called non-international armed conflicts. So we're concerned with international because when a country is occupying another territory, it's automatically an international armed conflict. And in 1977, the countries came together and they decided that the transfer of the population from the occupying power's territory into the territory it occupies is a grave breach, what's known as a grave breach of the Geneva Conventions. The idea already in 1949 was that they were concerned that in an occupation is when an army of one country has taken effective control over another territory that is not its own, that it does not have sovereignty over, and administers that area. There are all kinds of rules about what it can and cannot do. But one of the things it cannot do, and one of the things that the drafters of the Fourth Geneva Convention and later the additional protocols were concerned about, is demographic change. They had seen what happened in World War II. They did not want to see that happen again. And that is exactly right. What is happening is that Israel has demographically changed the occupied territory. Right now, there are more than 600,000 settlers in the West Bank, including Jerusalem. that constitutes almost 1/7 of the population of Israel, right? And every time there is any kind of armed conflict, additional hostilities that happen in the area between Israel and the Palestinians, the Israeli government approves expansions of Israeli settlements. And Israelis are provided with tax incentives, lower housing costs, and other incentives to move across the border into these settlements. That is Israel transferring its population. It does not have to be that they put them on buses and they drive them across. They only need to create the circumstances that encourage and facilitate that transfer. Companies that are building settlements, infrastructure, and otherwise facilitating that same transfer are complicit in that war crime. So as soon as in 1977, in the additional protocol, when it was called a grave breach, the grave breaches of international humanitarian law, primarily from the Geneva Conventions, were what ended up becoming customary international criminal law and the basis for the statute of the Rome Statute, which is the statute of the International Criminal Court. And today, the international community, which I say, broadly, there are countries that don't agree, primarily the United States and Israel, would say that it is a war crime to facilitate that transfer of the population from the occupying power into the occupied territory. So what we did was we conducted an investigation for 2 years. That was a transnational investigation, took place in Israel, Palestine, the occupied Palestinian territory, and the Netherlands, to understand the relationship between the Dutch company and what was happening on the ground. And after we had collected overwhelming evidence, and the reason I say overwhelming evidence is for 2 reasons. We could have had just a baseline level of evidence. That is all that is required for filing a criminal complaint of this sort. But we know that we're up against 2 different hurdles. One is that we're dealing with Israel. And even though the defendants, right, those who are accused in our criminal complaint are Dutch nationals, either the corporations themselves, it's 2 corporations, a parent and a subsidiary, or their main executives, who we also name in our criminal complaint. Even though we're dealing with Dutch nationals, we are implicating Israeli activities, right? We are saying that they are aiding and abetting who? Israelis, Israeli government actors, high-level military actors, right? We don't even have to name them. But we know that in order for a Dutch prosecutor to prosecute this case, they will have to accept that the underlying crime is committed principally by Israeli actors. So we know that that's a hurdle. And the second hurdle is the fact that despite all of the great progress that particularly Europe has made over the past decade in holding corporations accountable, they still are seen with some kind of elevated status. So the same way that it is difficult to hold state actors accountable for their actions, corporate actors are still, to some extent, receiving that kind of extra legitimacy or deference. And so we have those two hurdles. And so in order to overcome them, we investigate beyond what would be the minimum requirements. So that when we come to a prosecutor, we want them to say, there's no way I can turn away from this, because there is so much evidence here that I don't even need to do any additional investigation to have all of the elements of the crime met. They can do that extra investigation. We'd love for them to do the things that we can't do. We can't wiretap the company. We can't invade their offices, right? But we've done everything that we can. And so we are handing them on a silver platter this, slam dunk criminal case. And if they want, they can change that silver platter to a gold platter, but they've got it. And we received, in response in September, a very encouraging response from the Dutch prosecutor, who said there is so much that the extent of the evidence here is so extensive, so deep, that we need to take the time to review it. And as soon as we finish doing that, we will get back to you. So to this day, we are, letting the prosecutor do that. What I know from our co-counsel, so Global Echo, I am admitted to practice law in the United States and Israel. I'm not admitted to practice law in the Netherlands. All of our cases are conducted with co-counsel in the jurisdictions in which we file them. And our co-counsel in the Netherlands has told me that, first of all, this is a very positive response from a Dutch prosecutor. Not every case gets that response. And second of all, she has told me since October 7th that there has never been a better time to file a case in the Netherlands, because the Dutch public has never been more sympathetic toward the Palestinian people, as they are since they have seen from 2,000 to 10,000 to now more than 24,000 Palestinians killed in Gaza for what they cannot justify. And she believes that this will impact the prosecutor's interest in following up on this case. So that's where we are with this case right now. I'll say very quickly that we also currently have another set of cases that we are pursuing that have to do with the export of settlement products to Europe, and looking at the various ways that European import laws have been flouted, and the ways that Israeli settlement growers and exporters are, in essence, laundering settlement products in order to export them abroad, at the detriment of Palestinian farmers, who do not benefit from the same kinds of tariffs and preferential treatment when they go to export their products, and on top of that, have their water diverted to settlement agriculture, which is not even to speak of all the different ways that settlers have harassed and otherwise impacted the ability of settler farmers, of Palestinian farmers, to farm and grow their crops. So that's what's on deck for Global Echo right now. In addition, I've done a lot of speaking and briefing over the past several months because of my expertise on international humanitarian law and international criminal law. And I imagine that many of you are curious to hear, what is happening in the International Court of Justice and what is happening in the International Criminal Court. But I see the time and I'm happy to move that into specific questions so I can be the most effective to you. How does that sound, Jeff?
That sounds great to me. Do you we can go into a Q&A now. Do you want to, between Tony and I and you, we'll do it. So Tony has his hand up, so why don't we start with Tony?
Yeah, Emily, just a clarification. If the Geneva additional protocols were signed in 1977, that was 10 years after the 67 war. Did Israel sign on? Did the United States sign on? No. Okay. No. Just wanted a clarification on that.
No, and very much because of declaring that particular section of the Fourth Geneva Convention as a grave breach.
Right.
And Israel does not consider the 1977 protocols as customary international law. However, the rest of the international community does consider them customary international law. And what customary international law means is that it applies to you even if you're not a signatory.
Uh-huh. So, and that would explain why Israel insists on calling the occupied territories disputed territory.
Well, it's a fascinating both legal and linguistic issue because Israel speaks in many different voices. The Israeli foreign ministry and whatever is sort of how the government speaks externally is that it's disputed territory, as you said. However, when you come to the Israeli Supreme Court, the Israeli Supreme Court has called the territory occupied in more than 100 judgments of the court. That's been documented by Yesh Din. And the army claims that it applies the general principles of at least the Hague regulations. So that's an earlier form of international humanitarian law that excludes the Geneva Conventions. And then the Supreme Court says that it applies the humanitarian provisions of Geneva law, but it's never defined what the humanitarian provisions are. But in any case, what we know is that the Israeli Supreme Court has never agreed to rule on the legality of settlements. It has called that a political question, essentially.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Uri.
Hi, Emily. Thank you very much.
Hi, Uri.
I have a couple of questions. First of all, I'm wondering, since Israel captured in 67 the West Bank, that was never really a state, and Israel never defined its border prior to 67, since 49. So neither one has actually a definition of occupied territory, at least from the way you presented it. In other words, Israel can claim it was always ours because we never defined our territory. and that was actually under some kind of a mandate that was recognized only to the Hashemite Jordan, Kingdom of Jordan, only by Britain. I think Pakistan recognized that thing. So how do they square it when it comes to international law? So this is kind of the first question.
Okay. Is there a
Uh,
second question?
Yeah, the second question are completely on a different level. Let's say that International Court of Justice actually gets an interim judgment and telling Israel to cease fire. What kind of sanctions are available or demanded or required or actually available if people want, if 150 signatories want to do something, are they compelled to do that? Or is it optional, or how does the process work?
Okay, great questions. So first of all, in terms of the fact of occupation, that is, I mean, you've basically spelled out what Israel's argument is, why it would call this disputed territory and not occupied territory, and it's essentially alone in the international community. Even the United States doesn't say this. When it says, well, you know, in 1967, Egypt was occupying Gaza and Jordan was occupying the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. And so there was no sovereign of either of those territories. We're not talking about Syria and the Golan right now, because there's obviously that was Syrian and they just don't say anything about that. They annex that territory and assume sovereignty over it. And no one has, unfortunately, done enough to dispute that. But in terms of the West Bank and Gaza, they say, you know, there was no country that had sovereignty over either of those territories, and therefore they're disputed territories. Well, that might have been the way the law was written in 1949, when the Geneva Conventions were written, and they talked about high contracting parties. And so, you know, an occupation had to be between, you know, high contracting parties' territories. Jordan was a high contracting party, and so was Egypt, but they weren't sovereign. But the international community doesn't consider that to be the only definition of an occupation anymore. Not only can an occupation be of a territory that doesn't have a sovereign as a country, but a state can arise out of an occupation. The United Nations has recognized Palestine as a state, even under occupation. And the International Criminal Court has recognized Palestine as a state and a state party to the International Criminal Court. The United States does not acknowledge or does not recognize Palestine as a state. If it were to do so, it could probably solve this conflict in an instant. It could just accept that Palestine is a state, and we could have a two-state solution, and we could start to move forward. Other countries around the world, enough countries have recognized Palestine as a state. But even if it's not a state, the international community has recognized that an occupation can be over a territory that didn't have a sovereign, but was a disputed territory. So that's not a problem under international law for anyone, essentially, except for Israel. In terms of your second question about the ICJ, so I'll just back up a little bit and I'll say that the International Court of Justice is different from the International Criminal Court, very different. The International Court of Justice is a United Nations body. It is the highest court of the world, and it takes on cases between states. There are two ways to bring a case before the International Court of Justice. One is for a state to bring a case against another state. as South Africa has done against Israel now. And that creates if the court takes up the case, that would create a binding judgment. And the other way is for a non-governmental organization or another non-state actor to bring a complaint before the International Court of Justice. And the result there would be an advisory opinion. An advisory opinion is not binding. Now, there are both pending before the ICJ right now, dealing with Israel. Several years ago, several non-governmental organizations brought a complaint to the ICJ against Israel regarding the occupation, claiming it has gone on for more than 50 years. That is not temporary. Occupation law presumes a temporary occupation. This is an indefinite occupation. And asking the question of the International Court of Justice, the highest legal body of the land, can we still consider this a legal status, or has this occupation run its course and therefore become illegal, become a de facto annexation? That request, which the court took up, will produce an advisory opinion. Only 20% of the advisory opinions that the International Court of Justice has issued have ever been followed. And yet, this is not the first opinion from the ICJ, the first advisory opinion on Israel. In 2004, the International Court of Justice issued an advisory opinion on what was called the consequences of the construction of a wall in the occupied Palestinian territory. And in that judgment, it concluded that the entirety of the wall that Israel built between Israel and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, was illegal because it annexes almost 12% of the West Bank, and because of the grave human rights consequences. The Israeli Supreme Court rejected that advisory opinion, so they're in the 80%, 20% that follow these advisory opinions, and they said they rejected it because it did not adequately consider Israel's security risks. And therefore, in the Israeli court, and I argued several of these cases, Israel decided that in order to challenge the wall, each individual Palestinian village would have to challenge its own segment of the wall on a case-by-case basis, on which Israel would weigh the security considerations against the human rights harm. The case that I was part of that was successful, that Tony mentioned at the top of this meeting, was the Bil'in case, where we succeeded in the Israeli Supreme Court in convincing them that the human rights harm to the Palestinian residents of Bil'in outweighed the security considerations of the placement of the wall, because that specific route of the wall was meant to protect future potential settlers that were planned to move into those areas. And so the wall had to move to where there were actual settlement buildings. So Bil'in didn't get all of its land back. In that case, it got a half of the land that it lost, because it got up until the last house, essentially. So that is what happened with Israel's interpretation of the ICJ's last advisory opinion on this issue. On the issue of occupation in general, if it has run its course and become illegal, we're still waiting for a decision. In the current case where South Africa has asked the International Court of Justice to take up the case against Israel, where a state is asking for a case against a state, this judgment will be binding. 50%, as opposed to 20%, 50% of the ICJ's binding judgments have been followed. So that's still not amazing. But the bottom line is that so first of all, there's two things going on. Right now, South Africa asked for not only a judgment more generally on whether Israel is committing genocide against Palestinians in Gaza, but also essentially what would be the equivalent in the American system of a preliminary injunction to stop, right, the activities now until there can be a legal judgment. It's anticipated that Israel will not follow what the court says. However, I will say at least two things. The first is that even when these judgments aren't followed, the International Court of Justice is the highest court of the land. Its legal opinions carry weight. They are considered the highest interpretation of international law that can be. Countries will decide for political reasons or for their own utilitarian reasons whether or not to follow them. But that judgment will be used over and over again to decide what the law is. So no one since 2004 can say that Israel is not occupying the Palestinian territories, because the International Court of Justice already said in 2004 that it's 100% an occupation, and all of occupation law, international humanitarian law, the laws of war apply. It is much harder for Israel to claim that those laws don't apply because of the ICJ decision from 2004. The Israeli Supreme Court doesn't even attempt to make that claim anymore. If the court says, yes, this is either this is a genocide or it looks enough like a genocide that we're going to issue this preliminary injunction, even if Israel doesn't stop, it will mean that all countries in the world need to do everything in their power to stop the genocide. When there is a genocide, unlike any other international crime, unlike crimes against humanity, even war crimes and the crime of aggression, there are 4 international crimes: genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and aggression. When in genocide, the crime of all crimes, if a genocide is happening, it is incumbent upon all countries all over the world to do everything in their power to stop it. And if that is the case, we will have to see which countries actually follow that. But my sense is that that will give a lot of power to at least what we're seeing from the global South, countries that are saying, sorry, global North, led by the United States, vetoed by the United States in the Security Council, we're no longer following you because this is dire, because it was dire when 2,000 Palestinian civilians have been killed, and now it's dire when 24,000 have been killed, and we are going to change the rules of the game. And so I think that if the ICJ makes that decision, there's going to be a lot of pressure on Israel. I don't think that Israel will suddenly stop everything that it's doing. It's a binding judgment. The enforcement is up to all of the other countries around the world.
Are they obligated to boycott? Are they obligated to do anything? Or it's each country out of the signatory can choose to do whatever they want?
There's what's called third state responsibility, which means even if the country is not directly involved. In fact, third state responsibility is already implicated in major human rights violations, never mind international crimes. The third states are required, and when it comes to a genocide, it's the highest requirement. It's not just that they have to make efforts. They have to do everything in their power to stop it. Now, that would be the requirement. What is going to happen is a question of politics and foreign relations and what countries will decide. But again, I think that we're seeing right now with what South Africa is doing, with Turkey even just arresting an Israeli baller for incitement to genocide, right? We're starting to see the global South say the tides are turning, Israel. It's not business as usual. Now, are they required to boycott? As you said, it's not about boycott. It's not about economic boycott. It's about using all of their political tools, potentially even their military tools, all of everything in their arsenal to stop it. If there is a genocide, it needs to be stopped by any means necessary.
If you have to guess, it passes, what would the reaction of the United States for that thing? Would they just dismiss it, avoid it, do something partially, or do something serious? If you had to guess, I know it's guess upon a guess.
My guess is that publicly Biden would denounce it. Might even say it's anti-Semitic, it doesn't take into consideration Israel's security needs, et cetera, and that in backdoor, negotiations and pressure, that the United States would ratchet up what already the United States, I think, has restrained Israel, which is hard to believe. Just hard to imagine how much worse it could have been. But maybe it would ratchet up its, backdoor message to Netanyahu, to Gallant about how it needs to end, at least in large part, what it's doing, and Israel will have to make the choice.
What
There are
about
many
the
within-
area of
Could we
armament?
keep up with the queue? Uri wasn't in the queue, and we should follow the queue. Sorry.
What about armament? The last thing, in other words, sending direct armament, ammunition, and all that. If that happens, is there a specific thing, or this is just in the general thing? Do whatever you can for the country.
I'll just say lastly, and then Dick, let's move on. If the ICJ makes a decision that there isn't at least enough of an indication that there's genocide to make this preliminary ruling, then it would essentially criminalize the transfer of armament, as you're saying. And I think that you would see a lot more countries putting pressure on the United States to stop transferring arms.
Thank you. I appreciate it very much. Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you, Uli.
Dick?
I want to know more about the next steps at the ICJ. Are there chances for rebuttals or in cross-examination, or is it just each side gets 3 hours to present its case and that's it? And then I want to know about the media blackout. I mean, I had to go to YouTube to watch the first day. I don't know about the second day, but I heard you had to go way down on Google News to even find it. So it's clearly by the US media, the entire proceeding is being buried. So I want to know about that. I mean, is that the US response, just to blot it out and hope that it'll go away? And I also heard that Israel has not, they hired these British lawyers, but they didn't present any brief to counter the South African presentation, or even to put in writing what their lawyers said. So that's another question I have. So
first of all, Dick, it looks like the Earth looks very nice from where you are. So in terms of next steps, I mean, for this preliminary like I said, the equivalent of a preliminary injunction. There are just these two sets of oral argument, and now the judges will go and consider them. In terms of a media blackout, it's very funny that you say that, because I've been watching this from Israeli news, and the Israeli news is plastered with video footage of how proud they are of the the second day, of how their lawyers did such a great job, which leads me to something that I think is really important for everyone to know. I have already said for a long time that in order for Americans to understand Israeli media, you have to imagine that Fox News is every news channel in Israel, and it only gets worse. It's Fox News is like the most liberal, and then it just goes, sort of right wing from there. And now, ever since October 7th, every single, without exception, okay, the exceptions are, 972, right? But I mean, television, Israeli news channels, Israeli newspapers, they are not only supporting the war, they are part of the war effort, and they say so. They have a permanent tag on the corner of the screen that says "Together we will win," and they have there is no critique of the Israeli military actions, and there's no critique of Israel in the ICJ. The news coverage of this is, they literally say, look how the Israeli arguments were a slam dunk. They, there's no possible counter to these arguments. Look how strong these arguments were. Look what incredible lawyers we have representing us. It's not just, it's a propaganda machine in all senses of the word. So that information is very, very available to Israelis. I have no idea what's happening. I didn't experience what you did on the United States side, so I can't speak to it.
Well, you can watch it, but you have to go to YouTube. If you go to
Okay.
YouTube, there's many, like even Deutsche Welle had it broadcast. The German government won't allow demonstrations on behalf of Palestinians, but they allowed the South African team to make their full presentation, and it was televised and broadcast around the world.
Right. So, so I don't know what's going on there. I can't speak to that. But in terms of next steps, so the ICJ will presumably give have a quick turnaround, because they understand the urgency. Every day, not only are Palestinians in Gaza, not to even mention what's happening in the West Bank, and incredible settler violence and uptick in soldier attacks and raids in the West Bank. But obviously in Gaza, not only are Gazans being bombed, but also they're on the verge of starvation. And the ICJ understands the urgency. So we should see a decision in the preliminary request as soon as possible, probably in the coming days. And then in terms of the broader the broader question, the broader deliberations, that could take months.
Yeah. Now, when they issue a decision, is it simply a majority vote of the court, like the Supreme Court, or
Yeah.
do you have to have full consensus?
No, it's a majority vote, and then you will see if there are any concurrences or dissenting opinions. Most judges will write their own separate opinion.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Samir?
Okay, I had my hand up.
Oh, okay. Sorry, Jeff.
I've got three questions, two of which I think will be very short. The first one is, you mentioned that Israel and corporations working with Israel take resources from the West Bank. How much is that worth? Israel's got a $500 billion GDP. How big an effect is that? The second thing is that my understanding is that the Montevideo Conference of 1933 lists 4 criteria for a state. The very first one is a defined area. Now, does Israel's status as a state weaken because it doesn't define its area? And Palestine has defined itself as a state. Has it defined its area? So that's the second question. And the third question is, the U.S. is clearly complicit in Israel's crime of genocide, if it, as it does. How is the United States going to be affected by a ruling against Israel? And thank you.
Okay. I'm quickly looking up the stats on the GDP. Okay. One stat that I can give you, and I would have to get back to you for more of them, is that it is estimated that the Palestinian economy loses 3.5 of its GDP each year by Israeli and foreign commercial quarrying alone. So that's a very small percentage. I think you're asking, what is the percentage of the Israeli GDP that comes from the settlement economy? Is that correct?
No. I understand that Israel takes resources from the West Bank. The question is, how big an effect is that on Israel? How much does that add to Israel's GDP?
Right.
Is that a big thing or a little thing?
The bottom line is that we cannot distinguish the Israeli economy from the settler economy. It's essentially impossible, because there isn't adequate tracking of what is settlement products, what is settlement, economy, industry, etc. What we can only sort of imagine, and I can get back to you with the exact statistics, but what I will say is that we know that the West Bank is a huge source of water for Israel, for mainland Israel. And we also know that a huge percentage of the aggregates that then become go into all kinds of construction and other uses come from the West Bank, and that Israeli agriculture depends on settlement farming. So I don't, off the top of my on my fingertips, have the exact statistics. I know that if I search through the materials that I have, we have several different important and relevant statistics. I know that there are many organizations that have calculated how much the Palestinian economy loses every year because of the settlement, and because of Israel's exploitation of the occupied territory. And this is classic kind of colonial, right, exploitation of lands that are occupied or dominated. So anyway, I would have to get back to you about the statistics. You had two other questions. can you remind me what they-
The Montevideo Convention and
Right.
Israel not having a border,
right, Montevideo, yeah.
and the U.S. complicity.
Right. So in terms of Montevideo, it's, there are a lot of this is, for others, this was the kind of quintessential definition. I think there are actually 5 criteria for what a state would be. You're saying 4. I think I remember 5, but it could be that it's only 4. And one of them is defined borders. Another is effective control over those borders. And I don't, I think part of it is also, does the international community recognize that state? And the international community has 100% recognized Israel since 1948, overwhelmingly. At least, maybe not 100%. And at this point, Palestine is also overwhelmingly accepted as a state, even though arguably, we know what its borders are, essentially, 67 borders. And in that case, that would also be what Israel's borders are. But it absolutely does not have effective control over those areas. And I think that the international community has come to a different place since the Montevideo Convention and has said that states can arise under occupation. And therefore the effective control piece is negated. In terms of US complicity, I don't know if all of you are aware, but there is currently a case pending that the Center for Constitutional Rights out of New York has led on behalf of several American Palestinian litigants. That is a case against Joe Biden, calling for the US government to essentially stop sending any arms or any support to Israel because of its complicity in genocide. And certainly whatever comes out of the ICJ will give that case more weight. It is pending. It's a federal suit, and we will see, what happens with it. But on, a more kind of international, legal, but also political level, anything that happens from the ICJ will give the rest of the international community a lot of fodder for coming after the United States. And we will see if the United States continues to maintain its veto in the Security Council, how long that will last. We've already seen that it abstained in the last set of votes around Israel in this conflict. We will see. It seems, I will say, from backdoor conversations that I've been having with the the professional side of the U.S. State Department, there is a lot of pressure to change, and there's a lot of resistance to what the U.S. political side is doing. We'll see if that makes
Thank
a
you.
difference.
It's Samir.
Yes.
You-
Hi, everybody. Thank you very much, Emily. It was beautiful presentation. My question to you is, what is Peace Now is doing now in Israel? What they are doing? And the second question is, how much Haaretz newspaper, how much influence have on the Israeli public? Those two questions. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Samir. So in terms of Haaretz, they, I think, have been the only paper that has at least been showing some of what is happening in Gaza, and telling some stories from the ground in Gaza. For the most part, Israelis are shielded from what is happening in Gaza, either because, as I said before, the entire Israeli media is not only supportive of the war effort, but part of it, and very proudly consider themselves as such. But also, I think because there just isn't so much of an appetite for hearing or understanding or humanizing Palestinians in Gaza right now, or the West Bank. Haaretz is one of the only papers that has done so, papers, you know, of record that have done so so far. And I have no idea what kind of influence they're having. I know that the kinds of people in Israel who read Haaretz are people like me, and that means that it's not reaching the mainstream. The mainstream are reading, you know, only stories about, at the very, you know, the most critical they would be of the government is that they need to do more to bring the Israeli hostages back. But Israelis are not seeing, they are not seeing genocide. They are also not seeing Palestinians in Gaza as innocent. They see them as supportive of Hamas, and they equivocate them with Hamas. There has been no room, that's how the Israeli public has been educated for their whole lives. There has been no room to distinguish. And there are many tragedies from October 7th and its aftermath. And one of them is the entire loss of humanity, of humanization by Israelis of Palestinians. So that is, I think that there is a very minimal reach that Haaretz has. And I'm sorry, I forget.
Yeah, about Peace Now.
About Peace Now, specifically. Yeah. So I actually was part of the legal team. I worked in a lot of Peace Now cases, specifically dealing with the settlements and their Settlement Watch project up until 2017. And I have not worked with them since then. So I can't say exactly what they're doing now. I know that, you know, they've been one of the only kind of Israeli organizations pushing for a two-state solution consistently, even when the Israeli public, you know, has not wanted to hear that. I don't know of their specific activities right now.
Thank you.
We have three lawyers on this call. Do they have anything to ask? Tony, I guess if there's no other questions, we can start wrapping this up.
Okay.
Does
anyone else have any questions? No.
Sounds like Judy might.
Yeah, I'm trying to,
Oh, there's Judy Levitt. Okay, go ahead, Judy.
Hi, Judy.
but was I being counted as one of the lawyers? I don't know.
Yes, I count you as one of the lawyers.
I haven't had my heart hasn't been active since at least 92 or so, but no, I'm gonna ask about that Dutch case. So you get all this evidence, and this is obviously, it's criminal. So you bring it in Dutch, and what's it called? And they have to prosecute it there. And you got them to prosecute it. And what is their defense? Since you get all this evidence, what's their defense? Are they not helping people cross into it, or?
We're
Um,
not there. We're not there yet. We are still waiting for the prosecutor to take up the case, in which case then the companies would have to mount their defense.
So you gave it to them in September, and so then, okay, it's gonna move slow. You, are you working on somebody else to go after under that same principle of, enabling violations of the
Well,
international law? I mean,
well, actually, I'm glad you asked that, because I forgot to mention that we're also preparing a parallel civil suit right now. So the
that's what I was
criminal,
wondering, so they could really get punished with the civil suit, yeah. I
Right.
was wondering if you could even do that. Thank you for mentioning that.
yes, no, thank you for asking, because it's an important thing to mention. The criminal complaint would be, if we get to the stage where they're convicted, then a company can't be put in jail. So maybe they could be fined. It would be terrible for their reputation. Individual executives could be put in jail or could be fined personally. But a civil suit, of course, would sue for monetary damages, and that would also bring our Palestinian clients, actual remedy for what they have lost. And all of the Palestinians who are represented in this suit are landowners whose land has either been taken for the construction of the settlements that these companies serve, or whose land water wells have been dug that then provide water to settlers and not to our clients.
And this is the first case of that anyone's ever done under this sort of aegis of this international law and a foreign company enabling crimes. Is this the first one?
No, it's not the first case against a corporation for aiding and abetting war crimes. It is the first. It would be the first, assuming that the prosecutor takes it up. It would be the first to adjudicate the specific transfer crime that I talked about, of transferring the occupied population into the occupied territory, occupying powers population into the occupied territory. What we call transfer in, because there's also transfer out, which of course is deporting the occupied population, and that's also a war crime, a separate war crime. And so this would be very big, because this particular, I should say, as a side note, but I think interesting for this audience, because we had it with the Geneva protocols, additional protocols, the United States and Israel also backed out of joining the International Criminal Court because the International Criminal Court made this particular crime a crime under its statute. Israel was a huge proponent of the International Criminal Court and extremely active in designing its statute and laws and jurisdiction, and then backed out at the last minute because it included as a war crime this exact thing of transferring the population from the occupying power into the occupied territory.
And
And then the United States, in solidarity with Israel, also withdrew from the International Criminal Court before it was formed. So there's very much a history there. But in terms of
a good foothold, but if this actually works, it's going to be amazing, sort of knife into their whole thing. It's great that you're doing this. Thank you.
that's the hope. Thank you, Judy. But we're also, riding on the coattails of other organizations that have successfully brought criminal cases against corporations in different contexts. So right now, pending in Sweden, there is a case against the London Oil Corporation for its complicity in crimes against humanity in Sudan. There is a case in France against BNP, the bank, BNP Paribas, for financing atrocities also in Sudan. There is also a case in France against Lafarge, a construction company, for its involvement in Syria, in aiding the Islamic State in some of its activities there. And we also have civil suits that we've seen in the Netherlands itself, most recently against Dutch Shell Corporation for its activities in Nigeria, where the Dutch court said that the United Nations guiding principles on business and human rights, which are, for lawyers, soft law, not binding, they made binding law in the Netherlands in this case, and said that the standards for businesses in upholding human rights and environmental protection law, international environmental law, will be binding from here on out in the Netherlands. So there's a lot of really interesting corporate accountability, corporate responsibility work being done in Europe right now. And we're hoping to, take advantage of that trend.
What law school did you go to? Just curious.
UC Berkeley.
Okay, thanks.
Shaquille, you had your hand up.
Okay, Shaquille has his hand up, and then Uri. And I want to remind you that that there'll be an opportunity to send a donation to Global Echo, and you've heard Emily, so you know how important the important work they're doing. And after Shaquille and Uri, Emily will say a little bit more about donating to Global Echo. So Shaquille, take it away.
All right, thank you very much. Emily, first of all, hats off to you. Mazel tov, God bless you, and bless your heart for doing all that you have been doing. I'll ask two questions, both are non-legal, if you choose to answer, if you feel comfortable to answer. One is, having seen the injustice so up close and so intense, how do you keep sane? And then question number two is, what do you think is the end game of this current saga that's happening in Gaza?
Yeah, these are hard questions. I guess I'll answer the first one. First of all, I have a very, very strong community of Palestinian and Israeli activists and lawyers who just keep fighting, and we, we hold each other up. I also am very, very lucky to have family who support the work that I do, which I can't say for all of my friends. And Tony is part of that family that supports me. I have a lot of friends who have a lot of tension with their families because of choosing this side, if you will, of the issues. And that's not the case for me. In my case, in many ways, my family kind of became more active and more interested in these issues because of my work. So I'm very fortunate in that way. In terms of what is the end game, I mean, it is, I don't think, whatever the end game is, I don't think it looks good. I think that the end game spans from either a reoccupation of Gaza that is indefinite. I think that Israelis are still believe that they can indefinitely occupy, they can indefinitely oppress 5.5 million people, and solve their, and continue to live their prosperous and free lives that way. Other alternatives are to essentially expel or make it create the conditions under which no Palestinian would want to stay in Gaza and force Egypt to open its border and then not allow them back in. And Israel, I think, is banking on the fact that Egypt has something like $28 billion in debt to various different governments around the world, and that it therefore might be susceptible to international pressure to open its borders to Palestinians. Either way, 85% of the Gazan population is currently internally displaced, and 70% of the homes in Gaza have been demolished. So there is nowhere to go back to. And the question is, who will rebuild Gaza? And the worst possible scenario, of course, is that Israel will continue to kill everyone who is there, either directly or as collateral damage for what it believes is its war against Hamas, which is an idea. And as Americans, I think we know you can't fight an idea. You have to find a different way. So unfortunately, I think that the range of possibilities go from horrible to unbearable.
Okay, Uri is next, but I want to remind people that after Uri, Emily's going to say something about donating to Global Echo, and David Mandela is still here. And after Emily's done, David will talk more about his campaign and people can ask him questions. So Uri, it's your floor.
Emily, first of all, unfortunately, I see the same way you do. Very bleak to extremely bleak. My question, information question, a specific one, is any armament manufacturer in the United States has been ever sued for providing armament to Israel, either civilly or criminally or any other way? That's just an information question.
No, and it would be a very difficult legal case to bring. And I will share that currently I've been, Global Echo is not a public organization so far. I'm hoping that will change later this year. So stay tuned. But we do a lot of backdoor advocacy. And what I mean by that is that we brief, government officials and diplomats and try to provide information that then will help them to make certain decisions. And I will tell you that I've been recently meeting with the arms transfer team of the United States State Department and trying to provide them with different types of information, both on what's happening in Gaza and what's happening in the West Bank. There is more appetite now, more appetite to hear information that does not put Israel in a positive light than I have ever experienced in 20 years of doing this work. Which might be surprising because, what we mostly hear is Biden being, unconditionally supportive of Israel. But I can tell you that those who are working for him aren't necessarily in line with that. And so, there is at least something to do on that front. Suing a particular company is just very, very difficult because of essentially all of the different points in the stream of commerce, kind of like supply chain, that absolve in a way a company from what is happening with its end product. But that's not because they shouldn't be held responsible. That's because the law isn't there yet. And that's something we need to work on.
Thank you.
Maybe I'll just take this opportunity to say, as Jeff prompted, that Global Echo is, like I said, looking to expand our work, to go public this year. We are hoping to make a big splash later this year with a series of cases that will take the settlement industry to task, particularly in Europe, because the European Union is Israel's #1 trading partner. And because of this fraud that we see in Israeli exports to the EU. But we will also be pursuing other cases, as I said, dealing with companies that are directly involved in perpetuating the settlement enterprise. You should know, if you don't already, that because of this war and sort of under cover of war, settlements have been expanding exponentially. Settlers are more emboldened than ever. There has been increased settler violence, and the annexation or de facto annexation of the West Bank is more alive than it has been in a very, very long time, with the idea that no one is watching, and the Israeli government is kind of saying to settlers, you deserve this after the attack that we had on our soil. So we are really, really hoping that 2024 will be a bigger year and a more successful year for Global Echo, and we rely on individual contributions. And so if anyone feels the desire to contribute to us, I will be very, very grateful. And I believe that Jeff circulated the link where you can either donate via PayPal or get information about, there it is, there's the link again, or get information about how to send a check. And I thank you very, very much for your time.
Okay, so thank you very much, Emily. And at this point, I am going to stop the recording and open the floor for David. So let me stop the recording first, which I've got to learn how to do.